Hi, everyone. It's Ashley Gronwald with Hunter Row Real Estate, and I am joined here with Meghan Newkirk. And she is a local author that I got a copy of her amazing book called Loving Naomi. And I just finished it. It was the best read. I so enjoyed it. And I'm hoping that lots of my friends and listeners will grab this book and read it. And so I just asked Meghan if she's willing to come on here and share about this book, about her story, because you've interwoven it through this book, which is awesome. So why don't you introduce yourself, tell us who you are, and then we'll get started with some fun questions.
Sure. So my name is Meghan Newkirk, and I am a stay-at-home mom, and I went to NC State University and never thought I'd be an author, never planned for it, never had like aspirations to be. I always loved to tell stories and enjoyed the art of creating things. And so kind of haphazardly started writing a few years ago and ended up writing this short story that turned into a book. And so I, live in North Carolina. All my family, most of my family lives here. My sister is within walking distance, my parents, my in-laws, everybody. So we love the area and I'm just super excited to be here to get to talk about my book because it's been a fun journey. So,
well, that's awesome. I do love to read, but literally when I got the book, I think I read the first 3, 4, 5 chapters, the first day I got it. I was at the playground with my kids and they were like, put the book down. I was like, but it's so good,
That means a lot to me.
Well, and it was so fun to read. It was like I looked forward to that time to read it. And so tell us a little bit about it. I mean, I know when I first started reading it, I was like, is this you? Is this Naomi girl, Meghan, but renamed? And I read a little bit or listened to some videos on your website and you had responded to, and I was like, I'm just dying to know, is this you? And it sounds like there's parts of it that are your story and people in it that are part of your story, but you were able to elaborate a little bit on some of them. Is that right?
Yeah. And actually, if I'm being honest, I don't think if I'd ever planned to publish that I would have necessarily made it so close to my actual life. I did not intend to write a memoir. It is not a memoir in any way. There's a lot of creative license there. But I think because I was kind of writing it for my children as a way to explain my own brain, the inspiration for my life just kind of was the seeds of where it came from. And, but like I said, I'm a super imaginative person. So I was like, okay, I get to take what I know and write whatever I want. And the idea of a blank page to me is super exciting, which I think to a lot of other people, it's daunting. But to me, I'm like, I can write down whatever I want and see where it goes. And so, yeah, there are definitely the thoughts that are in the book as far as the reflection from OCD and the kind of thoughts you can have. I mean, there's millions of ways that you can manifest OCD. But those are very similar to what I struggled with in my young life and still to today, in some ways. And so that is very accurate. The characters themselves are based on people in my life, but I took a lot of creative license. My brother-in-law likes to joke that because he's kind of he's the sisters in the story. He's her husband or fiance, and he likes to say that he came out smelling like a rose because he's like, you made me out to be a lot better than I really am. And I was like, well, it's not, it's not really based on you. It could be. So, but yeah, there's definitely things that have happened in the story that really happened in real life. So I have had many close friends come to me and go, did this happen? Did this happen? Did this really happen? And I'll go through and go, yeah, no, that really didn't happen. And then they're kind of disappointed when they find out things that didn't happen.
I know. I feel like I spent this whole time asking you those questions through, but I won't because I want people to
We can do that sometime.
That would be fun.
Yeah.
Well, that's so interesting. So for people who haven't read it yet, it is a story about a young girl who struggles with OCD and anxiety and how it impacts her relationship with her family, with a guy that she eventually falls in love with. And it plays out for her and creates some real obstacles and just personal turmoil, I guess would be the best way to say it, of just dealing with what she's thinking and afraid of what people would think of her if they knew what was going on in her brain.
Right.
And so I just want you to maybe speak a little bit into that as we're getting this going of what is this? I mean, with someone not having read it yet, what would you share about your version of OCD and maybe Naomi's in the book?
Okay. So I would say that, like I said before, OCD manifests itself so differently, but the cycles are the same. So you have the thoughts, then you have the anxiety or the panic, and then you have to do something in order to relieve that. And what's so hard with that is that it's not logical. There's not like this logical process of, oh, I think this thing, and so I must do this particular action in order to make the anxiety go away. And so I think it's hard because a lot of what happens with OCD happens so privately within oneself or with people who are closest to you who need to give you the reassurance that you need. And we all need reassurance. We all need to be told that what we're thinking is normal. But it becomes this slippery slope of torture, mental torture, that then it becomes abnormal. And I don't mean abnormal in the sense that people don't like to use it, but like it's not a normal pattern of thinking. Like most people have thoughts that are strange and then they let them go.
Right.
And with OCD, it's just it hooks in and it can't leave, and then the actions have to follow. And so I think for me, the struggle with just this mind on a hamster wheel is kind of what I wanted to capture in the story, more so than even the extreme thoughts. I wanted there to be some extreme thoughts, but I didn't want to shock people because, people who have OCD think some pretty outrageous things. And I thought, I got to go in a little more gradual. I can't take it to the far extent right away. And so I kind of tried to find that middle sweet spot of like, this is where the brain went for me. It can go other places for other people. And so hopefully we'll explain that cycle of obsession, rumination, compulsion, so that people can understand it better.
And a lot of what you talked about in the book was Naomi's thoughts of causing violence or harm to someone or something, seeing a hammer laying out, or what would she do if this baby kept crying? Would she hurt the baby? Those types of things. And like you said, it can manifest itself in so many different ways, where I'm sitting with my counselor in marriage counseling, and my counselor looked at me and said, Ashley, what you do is OCD. And I was like, I'm not offended by that at all, because now I see it's just an obsession that becomes a compulsion, and it's not healthy. And so it's become normal to me and my family, but it's not a healthy way of living. And it's like you said, the reassurance, and you said that a couple of times, I think, through the book, of like Naomi wanting reassurance. And it's like, sometimes that is good, and sometimes that is enabling. And I think you even said that in there. And my counselor is telling Jed, like, don't enable her, don't reassure her, and let her keep on that hamster wheel of fear, because what she's looking for is this hug to kind of relieve the anxiety. But if you don't face the anxiety, that you need more and more hugs and tighter hugs and more reassurance.
And it just doesn't stop. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think what's so difficult when you love someone with OCD is that you want to give them that relief, that immediate sense of like, it's going to be okay. It's going to be all right. Like you can do this, or whatever you're thinking. No, that's not, like I used to have worries about like what kind of things were on my groceries when I brought them home. Like, is that something that's going to hurt my family? Like there'd be a little spot on the bag, and I'd have to ask over and over again, like, what is that? What do you think that is? Is that something? And it feeds that forward. And I think learning that anxiety does not hurt you. It doesn't cause any damage. And so experiencing that rise and fall of anxiety is quite healthy. It's not fun, and it doesn't always get easier. Sometimes usually with practice it does, but the majority of the time, the more you do it and you see that the world is not going to explode, it helps to kind of push you through those things. I wish I could say that I'd mastered that, but I certainly haven't. But yeah, in the book, there's a lot of her being fearful of harming others. And that was definitely something that I was fearful of, this idea that when you think something, that it has power, and that in thinking those things, it makes you that awful thing that you think that you might be. Like, just because you might think about doing something doesn't make you capable of doing those things, or that you even would do those things. And the thought itself is just that. But I think it can be difficult to filter out what's true and what's not true when it feels and a lot of times with OCD, there can actually be feelings associated with, I don't know if I'm going to describe this perfectly, but there's a sense of which there's this emotion that comes with the thought that passes as quickly as the thought does. Mm-hmm. And you can't grasp it fast enough to actually associate what kind of feeling it is. So then you extrapolate on it, and you have to live back in that thought, and you have to try to recreate it. The more you recreate the thought, the more you think it, which then makes you think, I think I want to think that thought. And it's this feed forward that is hard to catch on to without abruptly kind of trying to break that. But it has to be the person who's thinking those things that wants to stop it in order for it to really get better, because, they have to want to be done, and they have to be fed up with it. So it's a challenge.
And I guess the one thought I was having is like with temptation, just having a thought that isn't, being tempted in your mind doesn't make that sin. It's what you do with that. And so, Jesus talked about that a lot. And so that's something I think that could be helpful to someone who might struggle with this, or like Naomi in the book, of thinking, I had this thought that I would harm someone, so that makes me a bad person or makes me feel guilty or shame, when it's like that is all it was a thought. And to not let that thought become something that you act upon, which now it becomes an area of sin, but it's literally could be just a temptation for a season, that it manifests differently throughout different seasons of life, I would think, for different people. So do you have any idea where this came from? Is this something you found in your own family lineage, or is it just unique to you?
Well, I think as I've gotten older and learned more about my extended family, I think there is a thread of this on some parts of my family. I think that for me, it kind of triggered by an event that I had when I was 8, when I had my appendix rupture. And I was in the hospital for about a week. And my mom just said after that, I kind of went from cautious to over the top.
Wow.
And then the cycles of, there is some research that shows that there's some connections with physical, either having like chronic strep throat or, some sort of infection. They've noticed some correlations there. Mm-hmm. I think they just don't really know. I think for me, it's just kind of how my brain works. And I have a good friend who's a counselor, and she was saying they're doing research all the time about analyzing how the OCD brain actually neurologically filters information, and that they're just very focused on things in a different way. So I try to look at it as a gift now, instead of, and that's kind of what I'm hoping this book shows people, is that you can live a happy, healthy, content life with OCD, and God really can use it and does use it for his glory and for our good. And so when we get a sort of label of any kind, whether that's depression or any sort of mental health challenge, that we don't need to look at it as a negative, but God can use those things, that it's not impossible. Because I did think that OCD was impossible for God to use. I thought, how can this ever be something glorifying to him? It made me, miserable. So I think seeing how God has used it already, it has been quite marvelous for me in just this short season since the book has been published even.
And I guess off script a little bit, I would love to give an example, maybe to someone who's listening that's like, I'm in the throes of this and I'm miserable. How could it ever be used as a gift? Now you have the example of you put your thoughts on paper, put it into a book that people can read and either connect with or now love that OCD person better. So you've created a way of making space for this and helping people understand it. What about someone else who hasn't put thoughts like that?
Right.
How could it be a gift?
Right. I think honestly, what the biggest gift for me it's kept me on my knees. Really, if I didn't have this, I don't think my relationship with the Lord would be where it is. Right. And so I think sometimes in those hard times is when I really felt the Lord nearest to me. And I think that's true for a lot of types of suffering. And so no, in the moment, it does not feel like a gift, when I'm worrying about, so I don't want to make light of that. And I think it's a process. I think I've talked to lots of people who have OCD who've said it's taken me a lot of years to see how this could could be something that I'm thankful for in the end. But that's true for all kinds of things that we suffer. I mean, you think about this world, like all the hard things that we can face. I mean, it's countless. And so how does God use any of those bad things? Right. And so this is just another one of those that you could go, wow, how would God ever make use of it in anything? But I will say that I have made more friendships. I didn't know anybody with OCD. And I have met more people who have kind of been silently dealing with these things, or even just mental health in general, felt like they didn't feel like they had a safe space. And to be able to talk about it and go, you know what, like this is all just part of the journey of sanctification and getting to the other side. So finding that unity because my brain does work differently. And so talking to other people who have OCD and being like, oh my goodness, we think of that the same way, or having someone who doesn't worry about the same things that I do, but still has OCD. And this one friend in particular, we kind of joke back and forth, like, thank God we don't worry about the same stuff, because we're both like, why are you worried about that? And then we can kind of move through it with each other, but we think about it in the same way, so we can identify. So I think finding people who know that way of thinking has been a blessing. And I think could be for other people, but it's a step out to be able to tell someone, this is what I'm struggling with. It's not an easy thing to do.
Right.
So,
well, that I feel like that gives me a whole lot of hope, because I've wondered, like, is this just something that I will struggle with? Like Paul says, the thorn in my flesh that I'll just struggle with. And that might be, but it also sounds like there's freedom for people in this, or ways of coping with it. So that would be my next question. How do you, I mean, you're a mom, a wife, an author. What does it look like for you to manage it? Because it sounds like those thoughts, or some thoughts of anxiousness, are still there. So you have to cope with it. How do you do that? How do you manage this in everyday life?
So my main fear now is, and has always been the primary one that I just kind of have latched onto, is germs. And that's very stereotypical for OCD. It's not that way I've worried about every category that you can with OCD. In some shape or form. But for me, being medicated and having counseling are the two main things that have brought me full circle. So I would recommend that for anybody. And I'll get on a little bit of a soapbox. Like, I spent a lot of my young years thinking, well, I'm to be anxious for nothing. The Bible says I'm to be anxious for nothing. And so somehow the fact that I was anxious was an indicator of how big my faith was, or how strong my faith was. And I think, getting medicated and getting good therapy, good OCD directed therapy was the best thing I could have done. And I would recommend that for anybody, and to really attack it from just the practical OCD. Like, this is how you break these cycles. It's very practical. And once you practice it, weaving your faith into it feels natural. So I would say that for me with the germs, having 3 kids is like a constant exposure. Yes. So I pretty much, like, anytime they get sick, or we're in a situation where somebody throws up my kids are right there, I have to use a strategy. And I would just say, for me, trying to find the middle of, like, I'll ask friends sometimes, like, okay, is this what you worry about? Like, do you worry about it like this, or do you worry about it? Not asking for reassurance, but just trying to gauge, like, where the middle is. So that's one way. I think also learning how to walk away from situations uncomfortable, walking away when, something happens where somebody's kid is snotty, and I may not have the certainty to know whether or not we're going to get sick or not over the next 2 weeks. But walking away from that, feeling that sense of anxiety, knowing that feeling will pass, that whatever happens, that even if we get COVID-19 or whatever it is that I'm fearful of, that God will provide, and that I will have the tools. So that's kind of my main strategy. It's not always pretty. My poor husband has to listen to me go, like, okay, like, I'm breathing, I'm grounding myself, I'm doing all those things, but it still feels terrible. And I don't want to lose control of that. I don't like the uncertainty of, are we going to get sick, or are we not going to get sick? I don't know. That uncertainty is what is really hard for people with OCD. Not knowing the answer is really difficult. And so that's one way that I have to actively be working in my brain. I actually recently took a trip with my sister to my cousin's wedding, and I do not like going to the bathroom in public bathrooms. It causes me a lot of anxiety. I mean, a lot. And over the trip on the last day, I looked at my sister and I said, Sarah, is your brain tired? She was like, no. And I said, my brain is tired. Every time I go into the bathroom, it takes me up and then I have to go down, and I survived the trip. I didn't get sick. Nothing happened. I used, all the protocol that you're supposed to use within normal reason. I didn't wash my hands 8 times, but there were a couple of times where my sister nudged me when I was about to put more hand sanitizer on, and she was like, you're fine. Like, yeah, it's okay. But I think I do notice that there's just a rhythm to it now, more so than a decide. Like, I don't have to decide anymore. I can kind of roll with it. But it's hard. And I think finding a strategy with a therapist is what I would recommend to others, walking with that therapist through what your fears are, what sorts of things you have to do, and then doing the exposure therapy of putting yourselves in those uncomfortable situations, and then having the tools provided by the counselor for how to work through it is the best way to tackle OCD, because I've now purposely used the bathroom in a public space since the trip, and it felt easier. And it didn't feel so much like a challenge. It felt more like kind of wanted to prove to myself that I could choose to do it instead of being forced to do it.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting hearing you talk, because it's like the anxiety, the roller coaster, fighting with yourself, reassuring, all those negotiating, bargaining, all that stuff I do, but it's not around germs. So it's like, you really can't just tackle what you see on the surface, because that's not going to help. So you've got to deal with the underlying issue. And I mean, as we're talking about this, it's a sense of control and a sense of fear of like trusting that we are not in control and that God is. Right. So it's just so interesting to hear about that, because I think to just focus on the behavior, we miss out what's going on underneath the surface, which is our heart, what we're dealing with. Because you and I are struggling with the exact same thing, but manifested totally different. And so I guess another question I would ask is, how do you help people understand your struggle without making it become a crutch? Because I think you could be like, I struggle with this, so then now everyone's going to cater to your struggle. Which I can do that. Mine's exercise and food related. So I could be like, I struggle with this, so I need to be in a hotel close to a gym, and I need to make sure we can eat at restaurants I feel safe eating at. And so now everyone's catering to my anxiety versus being like, well, no, we're not going to just go there, and we're not going to stay at that hotel. So you're going to have to work through that. So can you give any thoughts? Or
I think it just takes practice. And then it also takes just loving partners to be able to say, like, I know my sister's taken a brunt of it. And I really do talk about that a lot in the book. And that's really accurate, because it's hard to know where does the OCD start and sin start. Like, it's this circle of like, and also it's finding that middle ground, right? Like the things, and a lot of times with OCD as well as with, exercise, and those are all good things. And OCD actually kind of attacks the things we love the most. It goes after these things that are actually quite good. Like keeping my family healthy is a good thing, right? I mean, that's a good way to raise a family, right. But how far is too far? And so I've had to really seek counsel on that in a lot of ways. And I've had to go to multiple people of different parts of my life who I trust, who I can say, okay, this is the situation. And, this is what Scott says, which is usually don't worry about it. And I'm like, and then, I will go to someone else or my counselor and say, okay, this is the situation. What is reasonable? What am I being irrational? Because I oftentimes don't see it. And there are times where I'm right. And I'm the first one to say it. Then everybody has to say it after. But, but then there are times where I will fight it, and I'll fight the system knowing like I'm being irrational about this. And I do think that for me with the germ piece and COVID, it's been quite fascinating because I actually have not struggled with it. Like people assumed that I would struggle, but I think because I already had strategies in place. I mean, I always thought germs were going to kill me. So it's like, I already was worried about it and I already have strategies in place. And so it kind of threw me when everybody started doing things on purpose that I had been working hard not to do. And so it's, it's been a kind of, my brain's been like, wait a second, masks. Hold on. Like, that's not something we've ever had to do before. And so I think, speaking to your question, like, I think finding that reasonable space as best you can, expecting that I'm going to fail sometimes and that I can still learn from it, just because I maybe do a compulsion, and I make my kids wash their hands when they don't need to. It's not a failure. It's not a reflection of my success or my anything. Right. And so I think just kind of taking it one situation at a time, it's exhausting. There's no way around it. I mean, getting better from OCD is exhausting, or any sort of constant chronic mental pattern that's maybe unhealthy, but it's worth doing the work because the payout and the success and the blessings that come from that are worth the effort. But I would just say again and again, like finding a counselor. And if you go to one and you don't like them, go to another one. You're not going to hurt their feelings. You need to find someone that you can be completely open and honest with and put all the ugly on the table.
So another question I have for you, and I'm thinking for myself too, so I'm hoping that you can share with all of us. My biggest fear is that I'm going to put this on my kids, that they're going to see my OCD tendencies around food and exercise, and they are going to adopt them. And I remember when I got pregnant with my first, which was a girl, and I thought, I have to get this under control because I don't want her to struggle the way I struggle. And then now I've had a little boy and now I have another little girl. And I'm like, I have to, because now my 4-year-old is asking questions and noticing and picking up on these things before, whereas I could do them and she didn't know the difference. And so I think I had the biggest motivator of, do I want this for my kids' sake? Or, I've got to fight. And because like you said, it's exhausting. So what's easier to do is say, this is just the way it is. And I'm just going to fight this battle for the rest of my life versus trying to get outside of it and push through and find freedom. So I'm curious on your end now, as a mom and just passing this on to your kids.
Oh, I definitely, I remember my oldest was like 18 months old and I was in the habit of checking the oven. I have a blog post about this and I would say off for each of the knobs so that I could know that I had to say it a certain amount of times so that I would know that it was off. And he was not even talking and he just went off. And he was, on my hip and I was like, that's it. I have to go back to therapy. Because at that point I was not actively with my therapist. I was kind of on a break. I thought I'm doing great. We take little breaks every so often. And that was a light bulb moment for me. And then as my children have gotten older, I know we're genetically set up for this. So I'm always on guard. But there have been times where I've had to, if my daughter drops a chip on the ground and picks it up and my knee jerk is to be like, don't eat that. Please don't eat that. Mommy's going to have a meltdown. I will have, and what's gotten to me more than my fighting myself is when she goes, ew, I can't eat this here. And I go, no, eat it. And I suddenly get this mama bear instinct. The fear is suddenly not so big as the desire to keep them from being fearful of it. So it's it kind of trumps it now. And it's not always easy. I mean, there have been times where we've been places I think we were at somewhere with a porta-john and one of my kids had to go to the bathroom and I looked at my sister and she goes, I'll take her. And I was like, just out of sight, out of mind. I couldn't do it and it was okay. That was a moment that I needed to pass the torch and it was all right. So I think all of it, it's these little increments, these little installments of setting goals and saying, this is going to be my exposure. That's kind of the language that I use. This is going to be my exposure. This is how I'm going to fight the compulsion. And kind of, letting the process happen and just hoping and praying over them that they won't have the same struggle. And if they do, then game on. Like I will, we're not
Yep.
going to mess around. But
Yeah.
but I try not to put them in that box. It's been hard not to when they've had, because OCD is a spectrum that we all hit on at times in our life. And so I try not to put them in the box of like, oh, here we go. Like,
Right. Yeah. And I think, like you're saying, I want them to be free of it. And so I think it's a reminder, a motivator to say, don't get sloppy, don't get lazy, don't get complacent, and just accept this as your struggle. Keep fighting the fight. Well, I hope everybody goes out and gets Loving Naomi. Awesome book. Just finished it. I'd highly, highly recommend it. Thank you for your time today, Megan.
Thank you.
Please let me know if you do write another one. Would love to promote it for you. So thank you again and hope to talk to you soon.
Yes, thank you so much.
All right. See everyone. Thank you for joining me today. And if you connected with something that was said, I hope you will share this with a friend, subscribe, and leave a review. Thanks for sharing this journey with me at home, where it all begins.